Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Islam and Global Affairs fourth International Conference on the Muslim Ummah. The topic this year, governance and political authority in the Muslim world. That's our conference campus, which is its School of Foreign Service. Dr. Al-Arian received his doctorate in history from Georgetown University in 2011. He wrote his dissertation on the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt during the decade of the 1970s. He received his master's degree in sociology of religion from the London School of Economics and his BA in political science from Duke University. He's the co-editor of the Critical Currents in Islam page on the Jadaliyya electronic magazine. He received several awards that have allowed him to conduct field research in many countries. His book, entitled Answering the Call, Popular Islamic Activism in Sadat's Egypt, was published by Oxford University Press in 2014. He's currently writing a book that explores the relationship between nationalism and Islamism, or the tendency of Islamic political movements to adopt the nation-state paradigm in pursuit of their activist mission in 6 Arab countries. Dr. Al-Arian teaches introductory courses on the history of the Middle East, as well as advanced topics courses covering history of modern Egypt, Islamic social movements, Islamic law and society, and the history of US policy towards the Middle East. He's a frequent contributor to Al Jazeera English Network, as well as other websites and publications. While we wait for other people to join the conference, I'll make an announcement now. If you hear Arabic happen as you are listening to this, I want you to be aware there is, you can go to the SIGA website, which is izu.edu.tr/SIGA conference. You can click on select English channel, select Arabic channel. There is both an English channel and an Arabic channel, which is translating in Arabic. So very soon, if you hear Arabic, this is where to go, izu.edu.tr/SIGA conference. Without further talking, Dr. Abdullah Al-Arian, I'll give you an option. Option A, you can throw away your degrees and change your last name to Kushner and take a job at the White House for the next 30 days. Or option B, you can proceed with the conference and keep your competencies. Choice is yours.
I suppose I'll just go with option B. Thank you very much, Obeid, for that very, very kind introduction. And welcome to all of you who are joining us from wherever in the world you happen to be watching and listening. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure we've all been struggling with Zoom fatigue as we get to the tail end of this year. But it is really, I think, a testament, especially to this conference of the Muslim Ummah, but also especially to the people on this panel that you are joining us today. And it's my distinct pleasure to be moderating this panel, the title of which is Embracing Democracy, Requirements, Perils, and Prospects, with 3 very brilliant scholars, all of whom I've had the privilege of benefiting from tremendously from their work over the years. So I have kind of a distinct pleasure to be listening to them and engaging with them here today. I'll do a quick introduction of all of our speakers, and then I will hand it off to our first presentation. Every presentation, I think, will be something around 20 minutes. I might type a little 2-minute note in the chat box just to kind of give you a heads up. After all of our speakers have gone, there will be time for question and answer. So please feel free, if you're out there listening and watching, to type in whatever questions you have for our speakers in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to address all of them, hopefully at the end of the presentations. First joining us is Professor Deina Abdelkader, who is an international relations expert who focuses on Islamic activism in the politics, religion, and culture of the Middle East and North Africa. Her specialization is comparative democratization in the Muslim world. As an associate professor of political science at UMass Lowell, Abdelkader teaches classes in Islam and politics and legal thought, Middle East and North African politics, and women in Islam. As an Islamic legal scholar, she's one of 2 women on the Islamic Jurisprudential Council of North America, and she's also the co-director or one of the co-founders of an international research cohort entitled the Cohort for the Study of Islam and International Relations. She's also co-director of that cohort, as well as the co-editor-in-chief of a journal entitled the International Journal of Islam and Asia, and the co-editor co-editor-in-chief of a book series with Palgrave entitled Islam and Global Studies. She's also published a number of books, including Islamic Activists to Anti-Enlightenment Democrats, Modernity and the Principle of Public Welfare and Social Justice in Islam. She's also co-edited the book and contributed to the book Islam and International Relations, and most recently, the book Islam and International Affairs, Politics and Paradigms. Also joining us today is Professor Ann Norton, who is the Stacey and Henry Jackson President's Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Comparative Literature at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also taught at the University of Chicago, the University of Notre Dame, Princeton University, and the University of Texas, and has held fellowships at the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women and the University Center for Human Values at Princeton, and the Institute for Advanced Study. She's the author of a number of books, including On the Muslim Question, 95 Theses on Politics, Culture, and Method, Leo Strauss and the Politics of American Empire, Blood Rights of the Post-Structuralists, Republic of Signs, Reflections on Political Identity in Alternative Americas, a reading of antebellum political culture. And she's also the founding co-editor of Theory and Event and has served on the editorial boards of several journals, including Political Theory. She was educated at the University of Chicago, where she studied with Professor Fazlur Rahman, and she's currently completing a book on radical democracy and is turning to the problem of property in the remains of empire. And finally, we also have joining us Nader Hashemi, who is the director of the Center for Middle East Studies and an associate professor of Middle East and Islamic politics at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver, where I got to spend a semester as a fellow some years back. He obtained his doctorate from the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto and was previously an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Northwestern University and a visiting assistant professor at the UCLA Global Institute. His intellectual and research interests lie at the intersection of comparative politics and political theory, particularly in debates on religion and democracy, secularism and its discontents, Middle East and Islamic politics, democratic and human rights struggles in non-Western societies, and Islam-West relations. He's the author of Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy Toward a Democratic Theory for Muslim Societies, and he's the co-editor of The People Reloaded, The Green Movement and the Struggle for Iran's Future, and as well as The Syria Dilemma, and most recently, Sectarianization, Mapping the New Politics of the Middle East. He's frequently interviewed by PBS, NPR, CNN, Al Jazeera, Pacifica Radio, and the BBC, and his writings have appeared in the New York Times and Newsweek. Thank you so much to all of our distinguished speakers. We will start with our presentation from Professor Abdelkader, who will speak to us about on the theme of Islamic law and democratization. Thank you.
Thank you. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, if you want, you can put it in the display mode.
I will
maybe
go ahead with
slideshow, maybe. Yeah,
yeah.
Perfect.
So at the beginning, I want to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me and for Dr. Al-Arian's very gracious introduction. It is a pleasure to be amidst my colleagues. I wish we were all in Istanbul. I would have rather had that instead of a very grim day here in the Massachusetts. So basically today I'm going to address a theoretical component of my writing, and then move on to the realities on ground in terms of theory as well as post-Arab Spring realities. So when I talk about an Islamic state, I need to tie that basically to two concepts. One is that Sharia is for different places and all times, which basically means that it has to be malleable to whatever context we put it in. So it needs that malleability. Secondly, there is no conflict between the sovereignty of God and the sovereignty of man. The reason being is that there is a difference between human conduct, mu'amalat, and ibadat, faith-based conduct. And there's a difference between what is dhanni and what is qat'i. That is to say, doubtful issues versus absolute issues in textual sources in Islam. And there's a distinction, obviously, between the nas and human reasoning, the text and human reasoning. So this is how the layout or the conceptualization of how Islamic Sharia relates to an Islamic state. In Usul al-Fiqh, obviously the main two sources in legislating are the Quran and the Sunnah. But there is also ijma' and qiyas or ijtihad. And depending on qiyas or reasoning by analogy, we go through different ways of doing that, whether it's istihsan, urf, istislah, and all of those together make up what are called the end goals of Islamic law or maqasid al-Sharia. So this is what I base my argument on. Now, according to basically the four Sunni legal schools, they conceptualized al-maslaha and therefore al-maqasid's role in Sharia. All four madhahib agreed that there are four guides to al-Sharia, two of them dependent on the others. Al-ijma' and al-qiyas are dependent on al-kitab and basically al-Quran and the Sunnah. The difference between fuqaha, not madahib, therefore stemmed from their perception of Islamic law. How conservative they are in interpreting the text, whether they took into account the spirit of the law as well as the word, and the degree to which they viewed the public good or maslaha as tantamount to the other sources of the law. So first, in comparing Malik and Abu Hanifa, both schools take istihsan as an equivalent alternative to al-qiyas. That is to say, they both perceive istihsan as a strong source of law, so that it is commensurate to al-qiyas. However, Malik did not perceive istihsan to be in itself a legally binding rule. Malik saw it is a legal principle used when needed to make exceptions to the rules of Islamic law. The main second difference between Malik and Abu Hanifa is that Malik used istihsan as a source of law when he found that al-qiyas rules did not befit the culture or tradition of a society, did fit a preferred maslaha, and did not help in avoiding hardships and providing basic needs. Istihsan for Abu Hanifa, on the other hand, meant that he had to choose from two competing analogical reasons to decide an issue. Abu Hanifa treated istihsan as part of qiyas. There are four theoretical stands. So the Shafi'i view was that he took the public good or maslaha into account when there was evidence in the text to support. That is to say, maslaha was dependent on analogical reasoning or al-qiyas. Secondly, the Hanafi view, the Hanafi took public welfare into account, istihsan, or more specifically maslaha, as an equivalent source of qiyas. Thirdly, the radical view, different fuqaha who claimed that maslaha as a source of law could override the text. One of the famous fuqaha, Al-Tufi, a Hanbali, was of that opinion. And fourthly, the moderate view, mostly the Malikis, who considered maslaha only when it was mursala, neither prohibited nor permitted in the text. So Al-Shafi'i, for example, equated conveyed maslaha with recognized maslaha, since he believed the text to be all-inclusive of public welfare. Therefore, Al-Shafi'i could not conceive of a legal issue that would transpire outside the boundaries of the text. Malik, on the other hand, took istihsan as an exception to the rule. He took the conveyed maslaha as a cause to practice istihsan. Therefore, although he was misunderstood by many, especially his student Al-Shafi'i, he did not call for istihsan on the basis of nullified maslaha. Malik called for istihsan when there was no reference point in the text concerning the issue at stake. That is, Malik took istihsan as an alternative only when the text and al-ijma' did not provide him with an answer which is agreeable with al-Shafi'i's teachings and following Shafi'i's. So Ibn Hanbal takes maslaha as a subsidiary source of law. It branches off of al-qiyas from the basic four sources. Ibn Hanbal took maslaha as an extension of the aims and the end goals of Sharia. The difference of opinion on maslaha fell along conservative versus liberal divides rather than sectarian or school of thought dichotomies. Each faqih utilized al-maslaha in his legal practice. It is important to note thus that the differences of opinion in considering maslaha were related to the interpretive stance of the legal scholar rather than an ideology for the whole school. After all, Shafi'i was Malik's student, and this did not stop him from rebelling against his teacher, while on the other hand, a Hanbali, Al-Tufi, like Al-Tufi, went to the extreme of writing that maslaha could supersede the text. So when we talk about the goals of Islamic law or al-maqasid, it has a rich intellectual history that started out with the founders of the four Sunni legal schools, but it obviously gained center stage with Al-Shatibi in Shativa, Spain. The five maqasid are basically preserving religion, preserving the mind, preserving the self, preserving posterity, and preserving wealth. So how do we apply those to our current states? Um, First of all, preserving religion entails faith in God and the Day of Judgment and abiding by the 5 pillars of Islam. The preservation of religion falls within a larger context that is based on 2 issues: faith, aqidah, and worship, al-ibadah. Al-aqidah, or faith, is endangered in current Muslim societies. The right of practicing one's religion in many Muslim societies is restricted by current governments. For example, martial law in most of those societies restricts people from congregating even for religious purposes. And the mosques are usually guarded by armed police forces, especially on Friday prayers. Preserving the mind, for example, is related to education and the protection of the mind from anything that would ruin it. Aside from restricting inebriation, which is typically the way protecting the mind is interpreted, in Islam, the necessity of observing one's mores stems from the continuous process of educating oneself and teaching others about practicing the religion. The freedom to express one's religious ideas, therefore, is part and parcel of preserving the mind. Hifz al-aql. The reason that this research links the two is that it is practically impossible to separate them in the daily practice of religious norms. For example, when a woman wears a veil, is she preserving her religion as an individual, or is she also preserving her mind by publicly expressing her belief? So the variable property of this concept is the degree to which the government protects the practice and the expression of the faith. Okay, so I try to measure the government's reaction to, for example, wearing headscarves in schools or universities, publishing religious articles, books, building mosques, congregating for prayers or religious tutoring sessions. The other preservation, or the third preservation, is preserving the self. That is the third maqsad, and it deems it necessary to observe the sanctity of the human body by not violating it or any of its organs. Hifz an-nafs, or preserving the self, therefore considers it essential to maintain the dignity of man by not harming his body and by providing a basic level of subsistence. If a person's life is violated, punishment for manslaughter, hadd al-qatl, has to be observed according to Islamic law. The respect of the sanctity of the body is also exemplified in notions such as freedom of movement and travel and freedom of expression. The judicial authority, therefore, bears a large responsibility according to Islamic law. The authorities have to be absolutely convinced of the evidence before indicting a suspect. Therefore, arresting, let alone torturing suspects is a far cry, obviously, from Islamic mores and the elementary principles of Islamic law. The preservation of human dignity before and during imprisonment is also something that needs to be stressed. Incidents of torture and death during imprisonment is another variable that I look at. The utilization of police brutality to disperse political activists is also another variable that I look at. Preserving posterity is an important, obviously, principle according to Al-Maqasid. It is the fourth principle that I investigate, and part of preserving posterity is the religious emphasis on the role of parents in upbringing their offspring. So it is basically about educating the next generation about the religion and its mores. And last but not least is preserving property. Preserving property is upheld by prohibiting theft and extortion, distributing wealth in a just and equitable manner, protecting produce from spoiling, aiding the growth of a just and aiding the growth of public resources, prohibiting the control of people's wealth by way of deceit and treachery. Preserving property is also observed by obviously prohibiting riba. Preserving property is concerned with four main principles: the circulation of assets, tadawul, clarity and plainness in all financial dealings, wuduh, justice, adl, and protecting it from transgression, al-muhafaza ala al-mal, which is obviously also related, or tadawul is related to prohibiting hoarding one's money and prohibiting usury and prohibiting the monopoly of the market. So if you look at the graph provided here, the arrests were gathered, the information was gathered for those years to detect the violation of preserving the self. The third column is preserving what goes against the preservation of the mind and faith. And if we look at the categories of election patterns, this was a measure of preserving the mind and the self. So basically, I attempted to combine theory and practice in that manner in my studies. So the implications of the goals of Sharia in contemporary Islamic politics we ask the question, is democracy and Islam oxymoron, as principles? The public role of religion is that it has limits on its enforcement. That's issue number one. And secondly, the Enlightenment and the constant battle between reason and faith in Western versus Islamic interpretations of what religion means is there always in the background. And the attempt to always point at the Islamic State as a theocracy, which happened basically as we can well see in the Arab Spring, once Al-Nahda movement in Tunisia and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt took power. Basically, they were elected. The question mark in the Western world was, is this a theocracy? Okay, or the assumption automatically that it is a theocracy. So those are my theoretical assumptions. Now I move to sort of the more, the less optimistic views, which is currently how those ideas are challenged on ground. So there are contemporary theoretical issues in comparative democratization. Issue number one is how the field has went through a seismic shift in relatively recent years. And I quote here Gardner, it does not necessarily follow, however, that political scientists' results demonstrate anything significant about the norm under study. All political science shows in this situation, all it can ever show is achievement or non-achievement of the proxy measure that the political scientist has chosen to stand in for the norm's own validating conditions. This is precisely what Byrne meant when he referred to the sacrifices of political relevance on the altar of methodology. So methodology became center stage, quantification became center stage, which really is harming, in my opinion, comparative democratization. Secondly, there is a polarization in research methods between Americanists or scholars of American politics and international relations / comparative politics scholars. A 2009 survey found that 68% of IR scholars in the United States use mainly qualitative methods in their work, while 23% use mainly quantitative methods and 2% use mainly formal modeling. Only 4% of the articles in international security from the 1990s use statistical methods. And this is a quote from Van Evera at MIT. This is extremely difficult extremely different from what we face today as political scientists, and especially in IR, and especially as regionalists. So this was an attempt to undermine, in my opinion, regionalists and to allow more Americanists to be able to basically participate and voice their opinions via the vehicle of statistical methods. An example of this political irrelevance and getting hung up on methodology that I've pointed out is an article that was published in the American Political Science Review, which is a highly acclaimed journal, and in 2018. So it is titled Social and Institutional Origins of Political Islam. The article's main hypothesis is that political Islam was not founded or stimulated by Western missionary activity. And I quote the authors, "We can detect no statistically significant effect of Christian missionary activity in patterning branch formation, and the presence of large European populations in a district significantly reduced the likelihood that a Muslim Brotherhood branch would be established, challenging the arguments that attribute the growth of political Islam to contact between Muslims and the West." I mean, this argument is so outrageous and so out of context. So just their measurement was that because the Muslim Brotherhood did not choose to create a branch where missionaries were active, that this was evidence that they both had no correlation, okay? So, in my opinion, Islamic theory is in crisis in academia. Theory in general is relegated to irrelevance in academic political science discourse at large. Secondly, the abundance of non-specialized articles and studies that utilize quantitative methods in a superficial way without contextualizing historical or cultural experiences. Thirdly, the harm done by the retort between Orientalists, and by that I mean Edward Said's Orientalism, and painting sort of a wide-brushed approach to anything Western that attempts to address the region or the faith at large, which was met by the claim also that anybody who writes about Islamic things is an apologist, okay, from the Occident side. And then basically the pains of applying theory to practice. The historical context, firstly, of consolidated democracies versus contemporary Muslim societies. Most of the Western consolidated democracies did not have to go through the processes of legitimating their discourse, their theoretical discourse, first of all. And more severely is the second factor, which is the increase in number of factors affecting democratic transition in Muslim societies. So Muslim societies have to deal with the role of regional politics, the role of international hegemons, domestic interest groups, and this all equals the inability to apply theory to praxis. So basically, Muslim societies are faced with a lot more challenges on ground because all of those cogs in the wheel have to be in good order for a democratic transition to happen. Thank you. This is my presentation.
Thank you so much, Professor Abdelkader. And next up, we have Professor Ann Norton, who will talk to us about the perils of democracy.
Well, first, I'd like to offer my thanks both to Professor Al-Arian and to the Center for Islam and Global Affairs for inviting me once again to this really extraordinary conference. I'm honored to be here. There's a certain ambivalence in the title that I was given and accepted, The Perils of Democracy. Am I supposed to talk about the perils in democracy or the perils that face democracy? As I reflected on this, I began to realize that those questions are interwoven. Democracy is very dangerous. It's dangerous indeed. And I will talk about that, but I warn you, I think the dangers democracy poses are worth the risk. The perils we need to worry about come from those who fear democracy. Let me put this in very plain language. The greatest perils come from those who do not want the people to rule. But let me begin by talking about the risks in democracy, the risks that democracy presents, as it were, in itself. First, change, unceasing change. Second, the need to live with your enemies. And third, the possibility of great loss. Democracies are places of constant change. The more the people rule, the more change is possible. Laws can change, constitutions can change, the people themselves change. Nothing is certain, everything is at risk. Living democratically requires you to live with change. To be a Democrat, to live among people who rule themselves, is to live with your enemies. There are two reasons for this. First, no matter how alike we may appear, we are radically different. We have different occupations, different interests, different preferences, different ambitions, different ideals. We may have different religions, or we may practice the same religion in different ways. We may have different principles, different hopes for our people. And these are all exacerbated by party politics. Each party longs for the end of its rivals. Right and left, conservative and liberal, we know that the other party wishes for our defeat. We know they hope to keep us out of power, not only for this election, but for all the elections that they can foresee. But our differences and our enmities go far deeper. We know, we Democrats, that there are those among us who would like to see us silent, dead, or exiled, who wish that we had never been. A certain kind of conservative longs for the end, if not of history, at least of the possibility of socialists and socialism, of anarchism, of radical democracy. The socialist and the communist long for the end of the capitalist. Many long for the disappearance of alien and foreign people among them. Seculars long for the end of the religious, and the religious long for the conversion of the secular. We live with our enemies. Where speech is free, they announce their aims. They seek our annihilation. Perhaps we seek theirs as well. Perhaps not. Perhaps we are wise enough to see the value of certain of our enemies. Perhaps we are daring enough to take pride in their strength. Whether they fall before us or triumph over us, we walk among our enemies unafraid. That is the courage that belongs to people who rule themselves. Do not underestimate what this requires. Democracy is the practice of death, of many small annihilations. Democracy requires that at some moments, one will cease to be. You will be ruled. You will be overruled. The people will decide against what you will, what you believe in. Your voice will be silenced, your hopes defeated, your will lost. In every election, in every debate, in reports on public opinion, in walking through your polity, reading the billboards and bumper stickers, you were brought face to face, not just with the possibility of defeat at one moment, but with the possibility of an end to your project and your hopes. The will of the majority can wash over your vision, your aims, your will, your voice like a great sea. You can be lost in it. In the face of this devastation, more profound than death and encountered long before it, Democrats learn courage. You learn to stand for your ideals when they are mocked or rejected. You learn to speak when speech is dangerous. You learn to act when success is far away and even hope is gone. You learn to make your own judgments about right and wrong. You learn to doubt the wisdom of those whose opinion is more popular. You learn to doubt your own. You are forced to a life of choice and refusal, reflection, and will. You learn to be thoughtful in the midst of doubt, brave in the face of enemies, courageous in facing the always present possibility of loss. And then, perhaps you rise. So courage is necessary for Democrats. If we are to rule ourselves, we must be brave enough to live with our enemies. We must be brave enough to go into the unknown. Perhaps this is not yet common knowledge. It isn't common knowledge among theorists, but it is surely the knowledge of the commons. When we look for people brave enough to demand to rule themselves, we see that courage in action. Courage may be admired by aristocrats and soldiers, but it belongs to people who rule themselves. Aristocrats wear their courage like jewels, a sort of ornamentation. Soldiers wear it like a uniform. But for us, it is not a distinction, it is a necessity. People who choose to rule themselves need courage to make themselves a people, to make a revolution, to establish their own rule. They need courage to debate among themselves and choose their own government. The courage to maintain that government when one is in the minority, the courage to defy it when the government is irrevocably, irredeemably wrong. There is the courage of revolution, to be sure, but it is also the courage of ordinary Democrats living with those who oppose their views that is, I think, most admirable. There are dangers in democracy, and those dangers require courage. So what are the dangers? Those are the dangers in democracy. And I hope I have made it clear that they are answerable by one quality that theorists of democracy often neglect: courage. But there are also dangers to democracy. And I've divided these into two. There are the dangers that people talk about as being dangers to democracy, and those are Muslims are a danger to democracy, and anarchy is a danger to democracy. And then I'll talk a little bit about the dangers I see: authoritarianism, the mythology of Athenian democracy, and the belief that social homogeneity is required for democracy. As you know, there are those who think that Muslims are a danger to democracy, that Islam and democracy are incompatible. I oppose that view in my book on the Muslim question. In the book I'm writing now on radical democracy, I make a stronger argument. I find powerful advocates for democracy, for people ruling themselves among all people. I find those advocates for democracy, particularly in Muslim theology, political philosophy, and political practice. Those teachings are not for Muslims alone. They teach all people, all humanity, something of what they need to rule themselves. Consider prayer. Prayer is, of course, central to Muslim practice. I do not need to remind this audience of the repeated command set to prophet after prophet, pray and give to the poor. Muslim prayer captures the interdependence of individual and community action. Muslim prayer captures each person prays alone and the community prays together. Both are required. The form of community prayer makes human equality more visible. Muslim prayer teaches democratic practice. It teaches discipline. The command that one give to the poor reminds us as individuals of our common precarity. And like so many prescriptions and practices in Islam, it works towards greater equality in the community. If Islam is not a danger to democracy, but a source of strength for it, I'll say a little more on this later, then what are the dangers to democracy? The myth that democracy belongs to Athens, the belief that ethnic homogeneity is necessary for democracy, the desire for authoritarian leaders, and radical inequality, hierarchies of religion, race, sex, and wealth. First, the name and the genealogy that it carries with it. I would love to have another name for democracy than democracy. It is simply people ruling themselves, but this is a little bit hard to say. Students are confidently told year after year that democracy is a Greek thing. It began in Greece among the Athenians. But the problem is that if Athens gave us democracy with one hand, it takes it away with the other. Athenian democracy was a political process bounded on every side and in ways that are particularly dangerous in the present. Only Athenians could vote, hold office, or decide the fate of those brought before the people for judgment. One could live a lifetime in Athens and always remain a foreigner. Athens was a slave society. The demos, the people, was so small, smaller than Athens. It was also tribal. There were tribes who embraced foreigners, taking them in and making them their own. Many of the indigenous tribes of North America grew in this way, and the tribes of Ghana, a proud Ghanaian once told me, take immigrants of every race as their own. But the Athenians did not. Their demos remained closed to immigrants. Democracy has been haunted by this Athenian legacy. Democracies must be small because Athens was small. Ethnically homogeneous because Athens was homogeneous. Democracy could have slaves because Athens did. Democracies could not include foreigners or immigrants or those whose ancestry was mixed or uncertain because Athens didn't. Athens provided an all too ready justification for the exclusion of women, immigrants, and the descendants of slaves. The Athenian legacy, I believe, still limits political practice in the West. Academics and politicians argue that democracy depends on social trust and social trust on homogeneity. Remember Athens and forget democracy, because Athens proved that democracies cannot last. We can forget Athens. There are other paths. There are accounts of democratic practices among the ancient Sumerians. Massimiliano Tomba, in his book, Insurgent Universalities, looks to Russian peasants and the Zapatistas, among others. I have looked to the Muslim world and Muslim philosophy, but really, you can look anywhere. All you need for democracy is humanity. I turn away from Plato to Al-Farabi, who took Plato's description of democracy and transformed it. Al-Farabi opened the Platonic text, ruptured the Athenian model, recognizing that the democratic city was capable of both the greatest evil, he saw it also as capable of the greatest good. He refused the model of the ethnically homogeneous state for a state that attracted, welcomed, and included people of all tribes, all races. Forget Athens. The Ummah is a better model. Democratic politics, as Al-Farabi saw, is open to all. One needs nothing but humanity. A truly democratic city or people would not insist on integration. A true democracy would embrace immigrants. The fear of ethnic and racial diversity is a threat to democracy. But so too is radical equality, and that remains very much with us. There are still men who demand deference simply for being men. There are still women who are beaten for not accepting it. There are still people who believe that whiteness is a title to power. This is the whiteness of old bones. We cannot yet ridicule the claims of race. We are still too close to colonialism, still in the midst of racial violence, still able to see bodies shot in the street. We also have reason to fear those who long for money and power. There are still people who persist in the acquisition of wealth beyond all reason and the exercise of the power that goes with it. Philosophers, even ordinary people, often fear the appetites of the masses, the passions of the people. But I think we have learned to our great cost that it is the wealthy whose appetites have no limits. They will amass as much wealth, as much power as they can, and they will use it as they wish. Radical inequality of race, of sex, of wealth puts democracy in peril. The most honored statesmen and philosophers tend to point to tyranny of the majority or the danger of anarchy as the greatest perils of democracy. I disagree. The fear of anarchy fills politics and philosophy, yet for something that is threatened so often, it is remarkably hard to find. Politicians and media commentators will point to anarchy, but the places they point to are not anarchic at all. These supposedly anarchic situations have warlords and bosses. They are riven by feuds between the ambitious. They are chaotic, but this is not anarchy. There is not an absence of rule. There is too much. But if anarchy is hard to find, authoritarianism is difficult to escape. Authoritarian still holds an allure for the fearful who are always seeking a protector. Every historical epoch gives us its autocrats as evidence. Caligula, Hitler, Ivan the Terrible, Vlad the Impaler, Stalin, Hitler, you know the list. But there are also autocrats who are regarded as good. Alexander the Great, Alfred the Great, Richard the Lionhearted, not Suleiman the Magnificent, Caesar, Justinian, all these greats. Some had admirable traits and built admirable things, but all stood against the right of people to rule themselves. Abraham Lincoln, who had these ambitions himself, called them the family of the lion and the tribe of the eagle, even as he pointed out the danger they presented to the people. People who want to rule themselves must have souls great enough to see that the family of the lion or the tribe of the eagle looks more like the family of the jackal and the tribe of the vulture. In order to rule themselves, people must have the courage to oppose they know are wrong. They must have the pride, the dignity, and the sense of duty to stand against those who are, even those who are called great and lion-hearted. Authoritarianism, however, is not confined to great men. In the United States, we have learned to our cost that those most hungry for authority, most avid for power, can be very small indeed. The harm these do is twofold, for they do harm out of their ambition and harm from their stupidity. Indeed, authoritarianism is not confined to individuals, great or small. Weber famously saw the iron cage of bureaucracy imprisoning modern lives. People like us, are hedged about by rules and regulations. We are expected by the state to follow laws we do not know and would not understand if we did. We are embedded in systems that assess our wealth, our tax obligations, our debt, our creditworthiness, our health, our probable longevity, our political preference, and a host of other things by mystical numerology with no appeal. Critics on both the left and the right have long observed the tyranny of the rule of experts. Now we are faced with the faceless rule of algorithms. We have every reason to fear authoritarianism, whether it comes to us in the guise of a human being or a state. We have little reason to fear anarchy, yet the fear of anarchy shadows democracy. Where the people rule, each person is understood to have standing and freedom. Each has the right to leave if they choose, rebel if they choose. Each person may participate, but no person can be compelled. Anarchy is not only a possibility, it is a necessity. Anyone can leave, and so it is possible everyone might leave. Anyone can refuse, and so it is possible everyone might refuse. That refusal, the right to say no, is the guarantor of our freedom. Fear of those refusals restrains those in power and those who hunger for power. Anarchy is thus the shadow of the democratic in a double sense. Fear of anarchy shadows democracy, but anarchy also offers us shadow, a shade, a place to rest, a place to hide. The shade anarchy offers protects us. The people who are most free are often not those who govern, but those who refuse to rule or be ruled. Ibn Khaldun taught me much of this. He taught me that the absence of government is where authority arises. The desire not to be ruled, not to be dominated, is a human desire. Ibn Khaldun found it at the edges of the Maghreb. One can find the desire not to be governed in any people at any time, as people like Jim Scott and Eric Hobsbawm noticed. The desire not to be ruled is the first and last defense against domination. Most people in most of their lives want power to leave them alone. They believe that they should make their own decisions about how they live their lives, that they are the best judges of what is good for them. They know too that there are many decisions they are not capable to make. The best of them, most of them, know what they do not know. They will have the wisdom to withdraw from the decisions that they are not able to make. They also have the wisdom to know the decisions that only they can make. The wisdom of the community is great, but all communities need people who refuse old wisdom. Politics, as much as art or learning, depends on people with independence of mind. Ibn Khaldun taught that power arises among people who have had to fend for themselves. The absence of systems, patrons, and protectors makes them self-reliant. It also makes them turn to one another. One of the critical contributions of Ibn Khaldun is his recognition that self-reliance and solidarity are opposites only in the sense that concave is to convex. They are coupled together. People who live at the edges become strong enough to work together. People who have experienced colonialism have a powerful sense of what it means to be free from rule. We see the burden of imposed government vividly in Gaza and Ramallah and throughout occupied Palestine. But we also see it throughout the Muslim diaspora. We see it in the UK, where people live under the burden of surveillance and persecution in the Prevent program. We see it in France and the United States, where Muslims and Black people are repeatedly subject to police brutality, judicial entrapment, and discrimination. In the last few years, the United States saw our own aspirational authoritarian Donald Trump encourage attacks on our Muslim members of Congress, especially Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. Trump told them, "Go back to where you came from." And they did. They went back to the districts that had voted them into Congress. When they returned home, they were met by cheering crowds of their constituents. When they were up for election, they won easily. When we resist surveillance, when we resist police brutality, when we insist on the right to govern ourselves, we continue the anti-colonial struggle. What do we do then with the enemies of democracy? When the people rule, nothing needs to be done with them at all. They may be a nuisance, but not more. We can carry a few parasites. When the people rule, they have the strength to carry the weak and shelter the fearful. That is the greatest peril of democracy, fear. What do we need to make democracy safe? Courage. It is courage that enables the people to rule. We need courage to overcome the inequalities of imperialism and racial regimes. We need courage to turn away from the desire for protectors and strong leaders and confront the power of wealth. It is courage that enables people to meet immigrants and refugees as equals. It is courage that enables people to say, "You are welcome here, ahlan wa sahlan." Isn't this the courage that lives in the Ummah? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. And last but not least, we have Professor Nader Hashemi, who will address us with the topic of after the UAE-Israel deal, prospects, challenges, and obstacles to democracy in the Arab Islamic world.
Well, assalamu alaikum, everyone, from a very sunny day in Denver, Colorado. Thank you to Sami Al-Arian and his team for this conference. I like to use the term the dark days of Muslim history. We are living in the dark days of Muslim history. And one way we can dig ourselves out of these dark days is to participate in conferences such as this, to dialogue, to debate, and to try and chart a new way forward. And so I'm happy to make a contribution to this year's conference on the Muslim Ummah. I want to speak about a topic that you are all familiar with, and that, of course, is the series of diplomatic deals that have been struck between Israel and an increasing number of Arab states. And I want to talk about the consequences for democratization, democracy in the Middle East that flows from these agreements. And of course, there's a particular tension because in the mainstream framing of these agreements, they were portrayed as, diplomatic deals between former enemies. Isn't that a wonderful thing? The question of democracy really hasn't been part of the interpretation and the debate on these agreements between Israel and Arab states, but I think they should be because I think it's a big part of the equation. So the surprise announcement in August of this past year that Israel and the United Arab Emirates and then later Bahrain and Sudan and more recently Morocco were normalizing relations with Israel was celebrated across the American political spectrum and also in many Western capitals. This development was portrayed as, quote, a historic breakthrough and an important contribution to peace in the Middle East. Despite their deep differences, this is one topic that actually Donald Trump and Joe Biden completely agreed upon. In fact, Joe Biden tried to sort of take credit for this deal, claiming that the coming together of Israel and the Arab states builds on the efforts of multiple administrations to foster a broader Arab-Israeli opening. In other words, he was saying that, look, the Obama-Biden administration of the past deserves some credit here for this achievement. In the New York Times, Thomas Friedman wrote that the news of this agreement hit him like a breath of fresh air. Friedman has been very critical of the Trump administration, but on this issue, he dropped his criticism and called this diplomatic deal a huge breakthrough for regional peace and stability. David Ignatius, who is a foreign policy commentator in the Washington Post, agreed with this assessment. He wrote, "Finally, the dominoes are falling in the Middle East in the right direction for a change. It's a building block for a better future." Now, the truth, of course, is quite different, as a moment's reflection will reveal. What possible good could emerge from a secret agreement between a racist American president and his deeply corrupt son-in-law, a neo-fascist Israeli prime minister, and several Arab dictators? Now, adding to this roster, there is the figure of the notorious Saudi crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman. Reportedly, he played a seminal role behind the scenes as a consultant, advisor, and co-architect of this deal. On this measure alone, the Abraham Accords, as they have been officially called, should have been met with deep skepticism. The fact that it was not met with skepticism tells us something important about the ideological bias and the erroneous assumptions within mainstream foreign policy understanding of the Middle East in the United States and in Western capitals. It also tells us something about the new challenges and obstacles facing democracy in the Middle East. I think the only value of these agreements lies in its ability to teach us something. The celebration of these diplomatic deals is one of those rare clarifying moments. It exposes what has long been wrong with U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East, specifically its deep dependence on authoritarian and repressive regimes, while ignoring the core aspirations of the region's peoples for political freedom, accountable government, and self-determination. Given its weak foundations, the likely consequences of these diplomatic deals is that over the long term, it will undermine political stability in the region while further impugning, in the eyes of the people in the Arab Islamic world, the reputation of its key signatories: Israel, Arab authoritarian regimes, and the United States of America. Now, how can we explain these developments? Disappointment with US Middle East policy is a factor in bringing together Arab authoritarian regimes with Israel. For a long time, these Arab authoritarian regimes have been privately urging Washington, D.C. to, quote, cut off the head of the Iranian snake, in the words of King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, as revealed through WikiLeaks. For a moment, it seemed that the Trump administration had finally heeded this call. In 2018, President Trump withdrew the U.S. from the Iran nuclear agreement and imposed crippling sanctions on Tehran, and talk of regime change among Trump's foreign policy advisors flooded the airwaves. On 3 occasions, twice in mid-2019 and once in early 2020, an American military strike on Iran seemed imminent. Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed waited for these strikes with bated breath. When these strikes did not take place, these leaders were shocked and confused. The timing of the UAE-Israel Accord is very much connected to the perceived security implications that flow from these events. The signing of this agreement has been enhanced by the possibility, looking at the world from the perspective of the summer of 2020, the possibility that Trump, who has been a staunch ally of Arab authoritarian regimes, might lose the election in November, which actually did happen. Arab Gulf leaders know that Joe Biden has publicly stated that he wants to renew the Iran nuclear agreement and restart a dialogue with Tehran and adopt a more critical approach to the policies of these Arab authoritarian regimes, both domestically and regionally. So allying with Israel at this particular moment makes sense to Arab authoritarian regimes in this particular context. So while fear of Iran has driven the Emirates and Bahrain and Israel together, there is a more urgent threat that I think binds these states together: fear of regional democratization. This was on display in 2011, about a decade ago during the Arab Spring. The Emirates and Israel strongly opposed the Arab revolutions and celebrated the 2013 military coup in Egypt. In fact, the UAE played a critical role in subverting Egypt's post-Mubarak transition, as has been widely documented, and Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been funding the military regime in Egypt. The Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi has long viewed an emancipated civil society in the Arab world as a fundamental threat to its national security. Any victory for a pluralistic civilian rule in the region would be a defeat for the Emirates' model of military rule. It is for this reason that Abu Dhabi's strategic narrative of authoritarian stability was built on the premise that socio-economic pluralism in the Middle East leads to chaos under civilian rule. In private conversations with Western diplomats, the UAE has repeatedly made this argument, which sounds persuasive to liberal ears in the West, in part because it confirms long-standing prejudices about Islam, Muslims, and democracy. According to a leaked WikiLeaks cable, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, MBZ, told the American ambassador that, quote, greater democracy in the region will in the short term empower the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, and Hezbollah. This is the official Arab autocratic regime narrative. For a long time, it has found receptive ears in Western capitals and among liberal intellectuals. This argument, however, is deeply flawed and it's self-defeating. Fact: torture states in the Middle East do not produce Jeffersonian Democrats, but rather extremists, which is actually the desired result that these Western-backed military regimes in the Arab world would prefer. The support they derive from Western governments is predicated upon fighting the threat that they consciously produce with their policies. The real fear that motivates Arab authoritarian regimes is not the rise of militant versions of political Islam, but the potential of democracy that includes religious-based political parties that accepts the rules of democratic politics. This is clearly visible in Tunisia today, the one Arab country to undergo a democratic transition as a result of the Arab Spring, where Ennahda has played a foundational and important role in both the transition to democracy and its consolidation. How has the United Arab Emirates responded to events in Tunisia? It has backed political parties in Tunisia that seek a return to authoritarianism, thus proving the UAE argument a complete lie. Another factor that links the UAE and Israel together is opposition to Palestinian nationalism. In the case of Israel, the reason for this is straightforward. Crushing Palestinian aspirations for self-determination makes Israel's conquest of the West Bank much easier. In the case of the UAE and other Arab authoritarian regimes, Palestinian nationalism is a deep irritant because it stirs up revolutionary sentiment in the Islamic world, generates popular anger, and produces political mobilization against the regional status quo and the regimes that seek to maintain it. Now, the Abraham Accords have produced a huge moment of celebration in Israel and among its supporters in the West. We have to be honest that Israel has scored a major political, diplomatic, and strategic victory. Israel has never been stronger, while the Palestinians have never been weaker. Several Arab states have now abandoned, officially, previous conditions for peace with Israel and have effectively accepted the terms for peace outlined by the Likud party. More Arab states are rumored to be contemplating this move. Morocco just did so recently. There's talk of Oman and possibly Indonesia. Furthermore, Israel's sense of euphoria has been bolstered by the fact that the Palestinians are now openly mocked on prominent Arab television programs by senior members of the Saudi royal family, reflecting this changing attitude toward the Israel-Palestine conflict among Arab states. While this is an outright victory for Israel, I would argue it's a fake victory at best. Israel has made a Faustian bargain, a bargain with the devil, if you will, with autocratic Arab regimes that is rooted in two false assumptions. One, that Palestinian nationalism has been permanently crushed, and two, that the people of the Arab Islamic world will be content with living as second-class citizens under repressive governments forever that deny them dignity and democracy. In most of the mainstream commentary on the Abraham Accords, this topic has been pointedly ignored. Specifically, there has been little discussion or recognition that Israel's new allies in the Arab world suffer from expanding crises of legitimacy, governing restless populations with poor economic prospects. How long can these authoritarian regimes last, and what will Israel and the West do when they start to crumble? Now, this is not a hypothetical question. Israel had to face this national security dilemma before. Moshe Aarons, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and 3 times Minister of Defense from the Likud party, reflected openly on this topic with considerable candor at the start of the 2011 Arab revolts. He contemplated the viability of an Israeli national security doctrine predicated on peace with dictators, and he wrote the following, quote, "The ugly facts are that the 2 peace treaties that Israel concluded so far, the one with Egypt and the other with Jordan, were both signed with dictators, Anwar Sadat and King Hussein. The question that Israelis ask themselves at this moment is, if Hosni Mubarak's regime were to be replaced by a democratically elected government in Egypt, would this government continue to maintain the nearly 32-year-old peace treaty with Israel?" End quote. Moshe Aarons came close to admitting what scholars of the Israel-Palestine conflict have long known, that Israel's security in the Middle East over the long term can only be guaranteed by making peace with the people of the region and not with the dictators that rule over them. And this can only happen if Israel is willing to give justice to the Palestinians, which is a precondition for its acceptance as a legitimate state in the eyes of the people of the Arab Islamic world. Thus, far from enhancing the prospects for peace in the Middle East, the Abraham Accords will likely have the opposite effect. Viewed from the perspective of the peoples of the Middle East and not the authoritarian regimes that dominate them, Israel's reputation has been further impugned by recent developments. Beyond the general perception in the Arab Islamic world that Israel is a settler colonial state that has displaced and continues to subjugate Palestinians, Israel has now suffered a second blow. Today, Israel is widely viewed as a key regional backer of despotic regimes that oppose democratization, reject political change, and block the advancement of citizens' rights. Now, the future of the Middle East looks bleak. All the key social indicators suggest that this region is headed for a coming explosion. The current authoritarian order is unstable, given the volatile mix of repressive states with useful populations and dim economic prospects. When the next Arab uprising for dignity and democracy takes place, it will likely be much angrier and more violent than the one that preceded it. And a key target of this anger will be the leaders of the axis of Arab autocracies, but also their Israeli ally, an ally that is today proudly and openly helping to sustain their autocratic rule. So, in conclusion, what does all of this mean for the struggle for democracy in the Middle East, in the broader Arab Islamic world? Two issues that were previously separate in terms of their origins, the Israel-Palestine conflict and the struggle for democracy in the Middle East, are now fused together. They're deeply connected and integrated. This marks a clear departure from the past, and I think it's a turning point in the politics of the region. The Israel-Arab authoritarian regime alliance now stands opposed openly to regional democratization for the reasons that I've already alluded to. Both parts of this alliance have much to lose if democracy in the Middle East advances. Number one, obviously, the Arab ruling elites will lose their power and privileges, and Israel's abilities to subjugate the Palestinians and to continue its occupation will be severely weakened if democratic governments come to power in the Arab world and they demand land concessions from Israel in exchange for recognition or keeping existing peace agreements that have been signed. Now, Western governments here, I think, are also deeply complicit in this arrangement. Recall their euphoric reception of the Abraham Accords this past summer. Now they have another reason, another purported reason to back authoritarianism in the region, beyond the long-standing claim that authoritarianism has to be supported in the Middle East because it supports stability. Now there's another argument that Arab authoritarian regimes have to be supported by the West because they uphold peace agreements with Israel. We were reminded of this event just last week when France rolled out the red carpet and hosted the notorious dictator of Egypt, General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. Not only was Sisi hosted by Emmanuel Macron, but he was awarded with the Legion of Honor, the highest French order of merit for military and civilian accomplishments in the field of politics and governance. To my knowledge, no Western liberal democracy condemned this outrageous act by France, thus tacitly approving of the politics and the policies of the Egyptian dictator, and by extension, other authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. So as we end the year 2020, what I've just described is an overview of what the political landscape in the Middle East actually looks like. On the plus side, I would argue that because of these new deep linkages that were always hidden, but now they're out in the open, between the axis of Arab autocracies and Israel, any net gain for democracy in the Arab world will have consequences for the Israel-Palestine conflict, especially in those countries that have now established diplomatic relations with Israel. This future development also has the possibility of opening doors for the struggle for Palestinian human and national rights, although this is far from certain and nothing can be guaranteed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hashemi. Thank you to all of our speakers. I think this has been a really fruitful set of presentations that all intersect at this question of both the sort of theoretical construction of how democracies may or may not function, both in the kind of landscape of Islamic societies and also thinking about them in terms of the very real kind of geopolitical impediments and obstacles that exist, as well as kind of some of those social issues and questions that come up as well. So I think there's certainly a lot of common ground shared by these presentations, despite the fact that they're also extremely different from one another. I have some questions, and then we can also open it up. We have time for questions as well from our viewers and listeners out there. So if you have questions, please share them with us, and I'll be sure to try and get to all of them. But the first set of questions I have is I'll go kind of one by one to each of our speakers. And so for Professor Abdelkader, I suppose one question that tends to come up every time people think about the question of how you know, the sort of traditional structures of the Sharia can apply within the modern nation state context, and whether the fact that the modern state in some ways possesses certain kinds of powers, certain institutions and practices that were not particularly conceived in a pre-modern state context in which the Sharia was applied historically. And of course, this was sort of the challenge for modernizers, thinking of people like Muhammad Abdu and others during the kind of colonial era, to see how they can kind of retrofit something as dynamic and as changing and as diverse as and pluralistic as you mentioned the Sharia to be, within a very confined and rigid space of the modern state, particularly its legal instruments. So how do you see that kind of debate playing out, given the kinds of things that you outlined in your presentation, and whether there really is a possibility to envision a kind of Islamic political system or legal order within the confines of the modern nation state? And my second question for Professor Norton, I really like this expression, this really wonderful expression that you said, which is the faceless rule of algorithms. And it got me thinking about sort of the connections and intersections between technology and democracy. Because we've seen debates made on both sides of that question, that technological innovation and advancement has been seen as a tool of the empowerment of people, and a way for people to actually maintain greater ability to voice their opinions, and all the kind of wonderful ways that you laid out as far as kind of being able to have voice, to be able to express that courage. But we've also seen technological innovation as a tool of control by the state, and a tool to, as you mentioned as well, to exercise surveillance, control, more precise kind of systems of oppression. And so how do you see kind of thinking about the sort of challenges that come with this sort of faceless rule of algorithms, and specifically this question of technological advancement and democracy? And my final question for Professor Hashemi is how would you square the sort of basic premise of your argument as far as the authoritarian assumptions that underlie the normalization process between Israel and Arab states, when we think about maybe two of the more recent examples? One of them, of course, Sudan, which is a country that has had its own mass mobilization uprising. I mean, we're looking at a Sudan that theoretically, at least on paper, is in a post-Arab uprising era, in which, you know, the rule of Omar Bashir for 30 years was overthrown. There's a kind of technocratic government that's been put in place that's supposed to be more representative. Sudan is in the midst of a transition in which we're expecting elections in the next couple of years. So how is it that despite the idea that they are now considered a very tentative success story, having gotten rid of their authoritarian government, that they're still undergoing this normalization process? And then the other example, of course, being Morocco, which of course just occurred in the last few days. Given the fact that Morocco has undergone some degree of political reforms, they've had two elections in which the PJD, the Islamist party there, the kind of political party that has roots within society, that is more representative, has formed two governments now, albeit in coalition and albeit in very high tensions with the palace. But nevertheless, this is still technically happening on their watch, a country in Morocco that is technically more representative now than it was, you know, 10 years ago or whatever. So I was wondering kind of how you might reconcile those two examples with what we're seeing. So please, Professor Abdelkader, we can start with you.
She's muted.
Oh, I think you may need to unmute your microphone.
So thank you for your question, Dr. Al-Arian. I will move with the assumption that what you mean by the modern state is equivalent to a Western liberal democratic modern state. And basically, the separation of church and state is always
her voice is cutting very much. I can't hear her.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, now better. Thank you.
Okay. So basically, the modern nation state assumes that it is a prerequisite to separate church and state for democracy to flourish. And that obviously is something that relates to a deep-seated understanding or a deep-seated fear that if faith is in the public space and especially involved in politics, it will obstruct reason, it will obstruct scientific advancement, and therefore it will also obstruct democratization. So this is sort of even in academic circles today, you find that people talk about democratizing in the context of separating church and state. My answer basically is abiding by the goals of Islamic law. The goals of Islamic law are very much related to human rights. And so I don't see a conflict between modern state, or I don't see limitations from the modern state conception once we resolve the issue of the separation of church and state as a prerequisite. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I think that addresses it. Professor Norton?
I think I muted myself. That's a great question, and I'm very happy that you asked it. It's in some ways a very simple question, and I was thinking about it particularly after Professor Hashemi's talk. First of all, there's no tool that serves one hand. You can always use something for the empowerment of the people, and you can use it for controlling the people. On the other hand, there are things about technology, and particularly expensive and elaborate technologies like the internet or the development of algorithms, that really does favor the powerful over the people. And in two ways. First of all, we always forget that this is all based on hardware, on an infrastructure. And as we learned in Egypt, the state can pull the plug. And whoever can pull the plug, who can limit people's access to their internet, either by disrupting the satellite transmissions or getting rid of electricity, they control it. And that's not a power the people have. That's a power that only the wealthy and the state have. Of course, I mean, it sounds so blunt, but it is true, I think, that you have, and this is particularly true in the West, which I would not say is democratic. At best, it has democratic moments. We're struggling towards democracy. And sometimes we get there, sometimes we fall back. But in this struggle for democracy, when it's not there yet, you have as much speech as you can buy. And some people can buy a lot and some people can't. I can't buy an algorithm. I haven't got the skill to develop it, and I haven't got the money to buy someone to make one. And so all these apparently neutral, faceless things are not neutral at all. They tend to be in the hands and in the control of states, especially authoritarian states who exercise it more, and the wealthy. So sad.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, good question, Abdullah. Where does Sudan and Morocco fit into my argument? They are somewhat different cases, but I think they do fit into my overall argument. In terms of Sudan, look, the agreement with Sudan was struck largely by the UAE Saudi-backed military in Sudan with Israel without consulting the civilian section of the government that's part of this transition, or not consulting, and also not consulting with the broader segment of Sudanese population. And of course, what the United States is doing here is sort of engaging in these very shady shakedown deals. They go to Sudan and they say, look, do you guys want food? Do you want to get off the terrorism list? Well, if you want those things, then you've got to recognize Israel. That's the price you have to pay. So it's a very, it's a very ugly set of demands that are made of Sudan. And of course, the key point here, like in the other cases that I cited in the Gulf cases, the population weren't consulted. The same with Morocco. If you know anything about Morocco, major foreign policy decisions are made not by the, civilian elected government, which includes Islamists, but by the king. And so, the mainstream Islamist opposition or constituency in Morocco has already issued a statement condemning the deal with Israel. And of course, Donald Trump and Kushner are playing another sort of, ugly game here. They go to Morocco and they say, look, well, what do you want in exchange for open relations with Israel? And they say, well, we want the Western Sahara in violation of international law. And so the United States agrees to sort of recognize Morocco's, illegal claim over Western Sahara in exchange for relations with Israel. And of course, public opinion here also has been completely removed from these deals. In the case of Morocco, according to the recent Arab public opinion survey that was just published a couple of months ago, 88% of Moroccans oppose normalization of relations with Israel. Only 4% support it. So in that sense, there is a broader sort of unity here among all of the cases that I've alluded to, including the two that you mentioned, Morocco and Sudan. And of course, this also applies to Egypt and Jordan, sort of the two earlier cases. And what's so sort of, I think, revealing, but also completely goes unmentioned, is that when Israel engages in these types of agreements, these votes go through the Knesset. There's a vote. And of course, they pass because these deals are good for Israel, because they allow Israel to continue with its conquest of the West Bank. But in the case of all of these countries, Egypt, Jordan, Bahrain, the Emirates, Morocco, Sudan, etc., there's no public discussion. There's no public vote. There's no sort of public input. And that's, I think, the unifying feature here that ties all of these cases together with my argument.
Thank you so much for that response. I have a few questions here that we've received. I'm just going to read them off one by one, and then we can just kind of go down the panel again. The first question is for Professor Norton, and it says that the statement Islam and democracy are compatible has become a cliche, but many scholars argue that applying the Sharia is impossible in the modern nation state. What's your opinion about that feasibility? The next question is for all panelists. It says, is democracy void of ideology? In other words, are there certain ideological imperatives or principles needed in order to have democratic societies? And the third question, I believe, is for Professor Hashemi, and it says, in the Arab Spring countries, when people revolted, they carried their national flags in one hand and the Palestinian flag in the other. Israel and its authoritarian allies in the region will fight every attempt toward democratization. How can people fight for democracy using democratic principles and means when their enemies use all the underhanded tactics to frustrate their ambitions? Revolutions, by definitions, do not start with upholding democratic principles until they clean house. What's your take on that? So Nader, maybe we can just start with you in that last question.
That's a great question. The tactics that you use in fighting for political change and revolution often stay with you after the old order has been taken down. You have to be very careful of sort of using violent tactics, thinking that they can somehow be bottled up and put in the closet and not used again after the old order has been defeated. I mean, if you look at successful revolutions, even in the case of the Arab world, I mean, Tunisia is a case that's worth studying. The broader question of how can we advance sort of, struggles against these authoritarian regimes in effective ways, demands the study of other successful revolutions, but also the studying of the, Tunisian revolution. And I don't have time to go into everything here, but I think one of the key successes, one of the differences that separates Tunisia from Egypt and other cases is that the Tunisian forces for democracy were able to build broad coalitions across ideological lines. And they began that sort of coalition building at least a decade before the revolution actually took place. That's, I think, a key success. To think that it's only you and your group that's going to be successful is a recipe for disaster. I think sticking to nonviolent politics is absolutely essential. I'm not a pacifist, but I think in terms of strategies for revolution, that has a much higher likelihood for success. There's a lot of actual scholarly documentation on this. So those are the broad principles that I think one needs to sort of think about when we're trying to think about strategies for confronting these very despotic and ugly regimes. I think mobilizing global public opinion is absolutely important as well. I think public opinion outside of actual established governments are very much on the side of the peoples of the region. Now that has to be mobilized and has to be channeled into effective political change. Very quickly, the other question that was directed to all panelists with respect to the topic on democracy and ideology. Are there any sort of, I guess, ideological underpinnings that define democracy? I say absolutely yes. There are these basic principles. The idea that power should change hands, not through violent revolution, but through democratic elections, that there are rules for the game of democracy that have to be respected. In the United States, one reason why democracy has sort of collapsed is because, Donald Trump and his Republican allies don't really believe in the rules of democracy, as we're seeing right now, where, we're about a month and a half past the election, and they're still trying to overturn the popular vote of the people. The idea, in terms of ideology, I guess the core ideology of democracy is really that the moral bases of legitimate political authority lie in the consent of the people. I think that's the fundamental foundational principle of democracy. That political legitimacy lies in popular sovereignty, not in the sovereignty of narrow, smaller groups like the military or a theocracy or the business class. I think those are the fundamental ideologies that matter in terms of thinking about a meaningful democracy. Thanks.
Thank you. Professor Norton?
Yes, this is a great question. And I have a simple and a more complex answer. Yes, I do think. I think that Sharia law can be applied in the modern nation state, but that's the simple answer. The more complex answer is, what is the modern nation state? And it seems to me that there are three elements here. They point in different directions. The first one is the monopoly on violence, the old Weberian definition, and control over territory. And here, I was very struck by Professor Abdelkader's presentation and her emphasis on the way in which martial law is an impediment to faith. I think that's very important, because the governance by violence, and particularly by military violence, is opposed both to faith and to democracy. And that is one of the critical junctures in which people of faith, particularly, I think, Muslims, but all people of faith probably, can push for democracy against tyrannical states. The second element of the modern nation state is the one that Professor Hashemi just discussed: legitimacy from the consent of the people. This is a great meeting point. The principle, I think the principle of Ijma, I am a student of Fazlur Rahman, that is, again, another point at which these meet. And it is, to me, the most important point. But the problem is a feature of the modern nation state, which I think both Muslims and Democrats can agree is wrong. And that is the modern nation state, as it was developed in the 19th century and really solidified by Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations, is that the modern nation state is supposed to be an ethnic state. How do you make a claim to the state? You have to say you're an ethnic group. Why? What has this got to do with anything? I mean, this is no grounding for governance. This is simple tribalism. And so that element in the modern state, I think both Muslims and Democrats should find themselves profoundly and firmly opposed to. There's nothing wrong with this if it emerges out of historical circumstances in some way and has the consent of the people, or there's much less wrong with it. But ethnicity is not the ground. It has to be the consent of the people. And this, it seems, is consistent both with Islam and democracy, and both Muslims and Democrats should press for it and work against the idea of the ethno-national state.
Thank you. And Professor Abdelkader?
Thank you. I think democracy is definitely not void of ideology. You know, as Professor Norton has highlighted, you know, in tracing democracy to Athens, that's sort of, that's what is inhibiting our development of alternative democratic thought. The creation of the Westphalian state, the dependence constantly on Western liberal democracy as the sole definition of democracy, this is an issue. And, you know, I always tell my comparative students, comparative politics students, that even in the United States, even in the best consolidated democracies, not every minute of the day, all decisions are democratic. We aim for them to be that, but by all means, even the most advanced democracies are not constantly democratic. So, you know, yes, democracy in summation is, you know, has a lot of ideology, basically because we rely on the Western liberal definition of what democracy is.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions here. One for Professor Abdelkader. Can you elaborate on your statement that applying Islamic law is the answer to the question of the impossible state? And then perhaps afterwards for Professor Norton, can empires be democratic? Undermining democracy in other countries as has been a policy pursued by empires to maintain their hegemony. Are empires democratic, and are their citizens then responsible for their hegemonic policies, such as the 1953 CIA coup in Iran? So perhaps Professor Abdelkader, you can start.
Thank you. My outlook is basically, you know, one that looks at how do we define democracy within our what our societies have been calling for. So one of my research questions when I started all of my research was basically, you know, what does democracy mean in an Islamic context? There's constant reference that Sharia should be upheld. So, you know, obviously there are no books that, you know, there are many books that talk about fiqh and usul al-fiqh and what Sharia means in general practice, but you can't go to a direct, you know, source and find, so this is 1, 2, 3 Sharia. And therefore, I started looking for contextualizing my research, and I found sort of a good home for it in what are called the goals of Sharia. Why do we uphold the law? So those protections that I talked about, the 5 essential protections, are to me a good way of merging Islamic ideas and you know, human rights and what we call democracy without sort of any ideological leanings. Basically, the respect of human beings, the respect of citizenry, the respect of their participation in decision making.
Well, I guess just to follow up on that a little bit, I mean, if Islamic law is not, as a kind of a legal structure, is not subject to popular will, then how do you reconcile the idea that democracy, as we've just heard, is premised on that very basic notion of it being subject to popular will or popular sovereignty, when in fact Islamic law obviously adheres to kind of a different logic?
I don't think that Islamic law adheres to a different logic. I think that basically, when I first started my presentation, there's a huge separation between the state and governance, because this is what enters in fiqh terms into what is dhanni, what is doubtful. There is no textual sources, whether the Quran or the Sunnah, that tell you this is the kind of government that you should have. This is open to human reasoning and to interpretation. And this is a good point for the participation of citizenry. This is where the input from the people is welcome and common. So the separation or the seeming conflict between the sovereignty of God and the sovereignty of the people, which is always a question, I see it differently, because those are separate realms. Do I answer the question?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking kind of, if there's a law that's passed that is then perceived as being in violation of a kind of a basic Islamic legal principle or ruling in the past, sort of how those things get reconciled in terms of whether, one takes precedence over the other. Is it the popular will sort of as represented, let's say, in a legislature that passes laws or ordinances versus a kind of foundational Islamic legal ruling on a given issue?
So I think that saying that the popular will oppose a ruling, it has to do with the clarity between the divide between faith-related issues that are clearly mentioned in the text versus what I was talking about, which is more general. Okay, so in public opinion, for example, in a Muslim state, if you say that a person will be, they will cut off his hand because he stole, according to Islamic law, and the popular will is for that. I'm not quite sure, that basically human rights need to be upheld, and according even to, like I was saying, al-maqasid, you have to really make sure that the arrest and the treatment of this violator followed the rules. I hope this answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. Professor Norton?
Yes, I have an answer for her question too, which is that there are divine things at the root of every democracy. And some of those are maybe faith-related things, and some of those are what is owed to the human for its own dignity. So I think it's not a problem. But the empire question, which every American should have to be confronted with, can empires be democratic? No, they can't. They can't. They can't. It's a terrible temptation, because there is this belief among empires that believe they are democratic, like my own, that they are spreading democracy. And that is very dangerous, because it often causes people to set the consent of the people aside. And that is the core of democracy. You cannot impose a government on people against their will. You cannot intervene in their government, so that the 1953 coup in Iran against Mossadegh, no, wrong. And indeed, much of what happens today. There is an interesting feature of empires, though. And I'm thinking here of universalist empires, that is to say, certain conceptions of evangelical democracy or proselytizing democracy in the United States and France, and the Ottoman Empire. And that is, these universalist empires are useful and move toward the democratic in that they are open to people, to all people of very different ethnicities and races and tribes. But the problem with them is, of course, that they are fundamentally authoritarian, they are military, and they don't rest on the consent of the people. So no, although some can have useful elements against ethnically specific states. Now, I think the second part was, are citizens responsible for the actions of their government? Yes, to my great sorrow. And it does not matter if you oppose it, if you speak out against it. No matter how vigorously I opposed, say, the Iraq War, or constantly American policy towards Israel-Palestine, it doesn't matter. I'm still answerable for this as a citizen. And that imposes a duty and an obligation. But you also have to acknowledge that in this case, that my mere opposition does not absolve me, that the duty remains.
Thank you. We have just time for a couple of last questions. One is for Professor Hashemi, and it says, what policies would you give to the next for the incoming Biden administration with regard to US policy in the Middle East, particularly taking into account the influence of pro-Israel policymakers and their recommendations? And then a last question for all the panelists is, what are the prospects for democracy in the Middle East or the Muslim world at large? Do you see any hopes? Where and how? Which I think is an appropriate question maybe to conclude on. So we'll start with Professor Hashemi for both of those questions.
It's very simple, because this question keeps coming up. What advice do you have to the next administration, to the next government, whoever it may be? And the answer is very simple. Practice what you preach. I mean, the United States claims to be a democracy for itself, and it claims to be founded on a set of values that is foundational to its identity: liberty, freedom, human rights, gender equality, etc. That's been the official position of the United States, at least rhetorically, until Donald Trump arrived in office. And that's very much the position of the incoming Biden administration. In fact, they campaigned on this program of, look, the threats to authoritarianism have to be met, both within the United States, because they lead to the chaos that we're seeing right now. So the advice is, practice those principles around the world, including with respect to the Middle East. Now, interestingly, if you're following the debate, Biden has sort of, committed himself to sort of review U.S.-Saudi relations, to not give dictators a free pass, to try and distance himself from what Trump has been doing in the Middle East. The challenge is to hold the Biden administration to account. I'm not holding my breath that they're going to apply those principles universally, but I think that's the advice that I would give to the Biden administration. And that's the challenge that lies before every American citizen who cares about, democracy and human rights, is to make sure that when the Biden administration starts to lecture Muslims around the world about their chaotic societies, to remind them that, look, the United States in many ways is part of the problem by backing authoritarian regimes. In terms of the last question that was asked to everyone, what are the prospects for democracy in the Arab Islamic world? Is that correct, Abdullah?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the prospects right now look bleak. This is a dark moment. Authoritarian regimes now are very strong. I think the coronavirus pandemic has bolstered the authoritarian stranglehold that exists in many Arab and Muslim societies. So, looking at the short term, they look bleak. I think there's some areas of success. I think, Tunisia is a success. I think it needs to be strengthened. I think those people who care about democracy in the Arab Islamic world need to study the Tunisian model. I think on the periphery of the Islamic world, in Indonesia to a certain extent, and Malaysia, yes and no, there are positive things happening. But I'll just end on a somewhat positive note, because the prospects are grim. I think the simple fact that we're able to come to a conference like this, okay, in this case virtually, but at least we're able to gather together, free of at least censorship and intimidation, and have these types of discussions, whether they're in Istanbul or in Europe or in the United States. Those are areas where I think we need to, at least those of us who have a voice, the burden of responsibility is much greater in terms of assisting those democratic forces in the Arab Islamic world. Every country has its own unique set of conditions. It's tough to generalize. I think the prognosis, as I said in my remarks for the region, looks very bleak because there is a coming explosion. These authoritarian regimes are fundamentally unsustainable. The economic conditions, the environmental conditions are going to produce revolts and uprisings. We don't know when, but that's inevitable. And so the challenge is to try and support those movements and assist them based on advice that we get from democratic forces on the ground in those countries. That's the way I view this question.
Thank you, Professor Abdelkader.
Thank you. So the prospects of democracy in the region, I think, with everything stated, with all, our three presentations today, I think that there's a huge connection between what happens for our, hegemon and how things happen elsewhere in the world. That is to say, there is a direct connection between, obviously, as Professor Hashemi has highlighted, basically saying one thing and not following through in terms of policy, saying that we are encouraging democracies all over the world and then supporting authoritarian regimes. This is counterproductive. My view is very pessimistic also, because as opposed to Western liberal democracies and the difficulties that they have gone through in order to establish their seedlings of democracies, the very beginning is not at all comparative to the region and the difficulties it faces today in trying to establish those. Because you have many players, it does not only depend on the sovereignty of the people or the people's will, which is at the heart of democracy, as we have seen from the Arab Spring, especially in the case of Egypt. The popular will was overturned, and they absolutely have no power now to regain that. I hope that Professor Hashemi's projection that there is an increase demographically in the youth population, that this will bring about change and that those systems are unsustainable. But in the midst of the pandemic and the rise of populism, I am not at all optimistic.
And the final word for Professor Norton.
I think the prospects for democracy are almost always bleak, but nevertheless, it does sometimes triumph. And the where and the how are very important here. And I think back on the Arab Spring, which it was a bleak time, and yet that did happen. It happened. There are successes like Tunisia, but for the most part, it failed. But when I think back on that time, as a young friend of ours from Egypt, who is from an extremely secular family of artists, told me at the time that being in Tahrir Square had taught him that he didn't need to fear the Muslim Brothers, he could work with them. Now, that has changed, and yet it did happen. And people did learn that, and that must be in them somewhere. that if they learn that they can overcome that kind of division, if they can organize, as the unions in Tunisia and throughout North Africa have been doing, but with particular success in Tunisia, that will matter. Organization and cross political action and organization that does not remain within narrow boundaries, but reaches out to some. And that can happen. I mean, it is possible that we can see more democracy in the Middle East, but I agree with my colleagues. The prospects are bleak, but they're always bleak, and sometimes you can break it.
Thank you so much, Professor Norton, Professor Hashemi, and Professor Abdelkader, so much for your really fantastic and generous contributions. I hope that our viewers, wherever you are in the world, will join me in thanking our panelists today for their presentations. I just want to make one quick programming note, which is just to remind everyone that there are going to be more panels, more of the conference tomorrow. There will be 2 panels. The first one beginning at 3 p.m. local time in Istanbul under the theme of examining sovereignty, nation state, and the application of Islamic law in Muslim societies. And the second panel later in the evening at 7 p.m. local time in Istanbul under the title Conceptualizing Political Models. And you have the information there, both of those flyers. Of course, you can find all of this information and hopefully the archive videos of all of these panels on the website for the conference, which is listed there as well. So once again, thank you to all our guests today. And yeah, I hope you benefited as much as I have. Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you in the future conferences. So